Happy Thanksgiving. Probably this week you may have, many of us, somewhat of a tradition I would imagine many of us have done. In the last week you probably sat around a table with friends or family, and some that you wanted to sit by and some maybe that you didn't, but either way you sat there and you shared maybe something that you were thankful for. Maybe someone was thankful for COVID's over. I don't know. Did anyone mention that one? Like we're not wearing masks this year. So for those of you who never did, you're thankful that whatever. Lifeway did a post-COVID survey of things that people are thankful for, the top things they're thankful for. And according to the survey, more than 4 in 5 Americans, 84%, said that they're thankful for their family. Sizable majorities also note being thankful for health, 69%. 63% said friends, 63% said memories. They're thankful for their memories. That's interesting. I wouldn't consider that one of the top things. A half point, around half for personal freedom, 53%. Stability, 47%. And more than 2 in 5 are thankful for fun experiences and opportunities that they've had. And we should be thankful for all of those things. There's no reason not to be thankful for each of those areas. They each reflect wonderful blessings that God has provided. However, each of those areas have one thing in common, don't they? Those are areas in which we are thankful when things are going well. Probably not a lot of people. I'm sure there's some, because some of you said this last week in our testimony time. Probably not on our list, that the Lifeway list didn't have this, and probably not if people said it around the table. I'm thankful for the work God is doing in transforming me into the image of Christ through suffering. It's not typical around the Thanksgiving table. I love that this verse, I had a couple of messages in mind to address this week, and last week's testimony time honed my focus on James 1:2. I think it was Kareen that brought it up last week. I'm not sure exactly, but I think it was her. And we had a number of testimonies last week that actually were thankful for things in the midst of suffering. We've had a rough year. It was helpful and encouraging to hear how people have processed a lot of really hard things in our church. And consistently, there was appreciation and thankfulness for what God was doing in the midst of those hard times. Naturally, amid pain, we desire for the pain to go away. When we suffer physically, we ask God to remove our pain. I know theologically we need to be careful how we do that, but even with that said, I consistently ask for God to remove pain. And then quickly ask God, help me to be content with whatever you allow, but please remove pain. Help me be content with whatever you do in Linda's frail physical form, but heal her, right? That's how we typically approach it, if not just heal us, remove our pain, fix our broken relationships, reconcile them. However, often our spiritual life rises to its peak when our circumstances sink to their lowest. I desire for us this morning to consider this. We can be thankful in our trials, for in them we grow. We can be thankful in our trials, for in them we can grow. Let's turn to James chapter 1. I'm sure read a very familiar passage. If most of you may have this one memorized in whatever version you memorized it in, let me read it for you. James chapter 1, verse 2 and following through 4. Here's the command, just to draw your attention to it. The command in the verse, which typically we would focus on, but we tend to not, but the command is actually count. Count it. We'll talk about that in just a second. But James commands us, count it all joy, my brothers. When? when you meet trials of various kinds. So we are to count it all joy when? When we meet trials of various kinds. Why? Verse 3, for you know that the testing of your faith produces steadfastness. And let steadfastness have its full effect, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing. The command is regard trials as the grounds for much joy. This is the command. Count it all joy, or regard trials as the grounds for much joy. Joy. When reading a verse, we typically place emphasis on the command, but we do look at this verse, and typically our attention is very quickly brought to the concept of joy. And we see the imperative or the command in this often as rejoice, like Paul says. Rejoice in all things, and the command there is to rejoice. This is actually a little different. It's to count. But let's look at the concept of joy here. This joy is not intended to be some kind of weird, unnatural pleasure and joy in suffering and pain. That interpretation would completely miss the point of what James has to say. Rather, the phrase indicates we are to take every opportunity to find joy amid any type of suffering. Joy is like what I'm finding through my spiritual walk. Joy is like many, if not all, the other emotions. It has a passive, emotive aspect, but it also has an active aspect to it. For instance, we can have the emotion of love, right? We can feel love towards people. But we're also commanded to love, and that love is separate from the emotion itself. So at times, I have to love someone not based on their treatment of me, not based on my emotions, but willing to sacrifice myself for their betterment, regardless of how I feel, right? That's an action of love that's separate from my emotions. So we have both the emotion of love, which is wonderful, and it's great. We like it. The action of love is super hard to do. Trust is this way. Has anyone ever asked you, don't you trust me? And there's two ways to take that, right? In that moment, you may not have the sense of trust in that person. You may question whether they're reliable or responsible. However, you can entrust something to someone as an action. So you may not have the emotion of trust, but you can say, yes, I'm going to let you use my car, even though I'm not sure how I feel about that. I'm going to entrust this to you, right? We do this with people all the time. I'm going to trust you to do this. That's an action. This is the same way as we think of joy. Joy can be an immense, wonderful emotion, but I don't think that's what this is referring to in this text. When James commands us, count it all joy, he's not, you guys better have this overflowing, emotive manifest of excitement and happiness. That would be, how do you command that? But you can command, separate from the emotion, to rejoice in the midst of your suffering. You can choose to rejoice in the midst of the lack of happiness. Solomon, I think both Christ uses this, Solomon uses this once in Proverbs 5:18. It says, rejoice in the wife of your youth. Now, I think both can be true, but he doesn't give the context of what the wife's like. I'm not trying to be provocative. I'm like, seriously, I mean, who knows what she's like? The context doesn't indicate rejoice in the wife of your youth if she's great. Right? It's really giving someone a singular focus. This is the person within whom you are to rejoice. Right? It's an action not dependent necessarily on the circumstances. Christ as well offers us this in Matthew 5:12 when he commands his disciples to rejoice about the suffering, not about the suffering, but amid the suffering. He says, rejoice when you're persecuted, reviled, and slandered. Are they supposed to rejoice about being persecuted, reviled, and slandered? No. But they're supposed to rejoice in the midst of being persecuted, reviled, and slandered. It is a decision on their part to rejoice in what God is doing. We can only continually rejoice if our joy rests not in our emotions, produced by our circumstances, but rather a purposeful decision to consider the possible value within the circumstances. Like James, Paul commands the believers, rejoice in the Lord always. And James says that. Count it all joy. Count it all joy. It's not as if he's saying, count it only joy. As if joy is the only emotion that you can express amid suffering. And I'm going to jump ahead a little bit and use the example of Jesus when he comes to Mary and Martha. What is the value of the moment in which Jesus raises Lazarus from the dead? Does Jesus know that there's value in this moment? Most certainly. What is he going to do? He's going to raise Lazarus from the dead, and what's going to happen in that moment? His messiahship, his deity is going to be revealed. This is good, right? So him knowing the potential future, not the potential future, the future and the potentiality in this moment, what does he do when he sees Mary and Martha weeping over their dead brother? He grieves. So when James says, count it all joy, he's not saying only count it joy, as if that's the only emotion we feel in the midst of our trials. But count it, and the NIV says it this way, consider it pure joy. Or the Good News version says, my brethren, count it exceeding joy. Have overwhelming joy amid your trials. Have pure or exceeding joy. Trials are not an avenue for us to put on this facade of joy. He's not saying, look like you're joyful. Rather, we have an opportunity to truly and actually rejoice. Have you ever had a friend tell you amid some hardship, you don't have to put a front on for me? You can just be honest. You can just be yourself. I know you're struggling. You can be real with me. But what if the reality is you're actually rejoicing in your trial? My sister's, I hope she doesn't watch this. She's a little crazy sometimes. So I call her, Linda and I find out about Linda's cancer. I call Michelle. She's like, I'm excited about what God's going to do in your heart. That was her response. I'm like, you're an idiot and I hate you. She's suffered. She knows what God does in brokenness. She knows what God does in trials and suffering. And she's like, I'm excited about how God's going to transform your heart. I was like, I don't want to be transformed anymore. Like, I'm done. I'm good. I mean, I'm not good, but like, I'm good with where I'm not good. Like, let's just be done. Stop sanctification process. Let's just be done with that, right? Come back now or leave me where I'm at. I don't know. That's how I felt. I don't want more growth. Yet she's like, no, God is going to do a good work in your heart. Receive it. Count it. What a weird term. He commands us to count it all joy. He desires that we consider tribulations. In the midst of your suffering, have an accounting of it. Consider in the midst of tribulation in what you can rejoice. We're not rejoicing at the trial necessarily directly. Rather, amid the trial, we consider the opportunities we have to rejoice. And this is what Christ does. Hebrews 12:2, the author of Hebrews writes this: "Look to Jesus, the founder and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy set before him," what's the next phrase? "Endured the cross." So amidst the enduring of the cross, the trial, he's looking forward to the joy that's set before him. In essence, what James is asking us to do is be like Christ in that way. Amidst your trial, amidst your suffering, look forward to the joy that God is doing in you through that. So, James commands us, count it all joy. It has nothing to do, let me say it this way, it's probably more accurate. It has little to do with your feelings. God did not intend for trials to bring a smile to our face. He grieves amidst trials with those who grieve. This is not the time when people are going through trials to just say, "Hey man, just count it all joy." Don't do that. You're right, but don't do that. Counting it all joy does not equate to seeking out trials, nor do we pretend trials are pleasant. Trials cause pain and difficulty. However, we consider trials as an occasion for joy because they hold potential for producing something good in us. Now, we've danced around what is it that it's going to produce in us so far in this message, and you all know because it's the next phrase, but what exactly is it that we are to be excited for or find joy in? So count it all joy, or consider every moment an opportunity for joy when you encounter trials of various kinds. We're counting it all joy in the midst of trials. Count it all joy as you have various trials. In fact, the word for various is multicolored. Technically, it could be translated that way. Count it all joy when you encounter. An encounter there is not so much a purposeful thing as a stumbling into. So count it all joy when you stumble into, because a lot of our suffering is not something we do, and we'll talk about that in just a second, but much of our suffering is done to us or something we could not keep from happening. So in the midst of these trials that are hardships that we stumble into, take an opportunity to find joy in those varied, multicolored types of trials. Now, what kind of multicolored types of trials is this referring to? Well, there's one that I want to draw your attention that it's not referring to. Go to 1 Peter 1 and 2. Obviously, you can't go to both at the same time, but go to 1 Peter 1. Let me read a couple verses there, and then we'll turn to chapter 2 and read a couple. Peter says this same concept in 1 Peter. In this you rejoice. Verse 6. 1 Peter 1, verse 6. He's thankful that they have been caused to be born again to a living hope. In this, and they're going through suffering, Peter's writing to a suffering church in the dispersion. So in the midst of their suffering, their persecution, in this you rejoice. Though now for a little while, if necessary, you have been grieved by various trials. Same concept as in James 1. Why? And it's the same reason. So that the tested genuineness of your faith, more precious than gold that perishes though it be tested by fire, may be found to result in praise and glory and honor at the revelation of Jesus Christ. Now, I don't want to get too far ahead because we're in 1 Peter, but in essence what 1 Peter gives us is the same thought as James. Look at the trials that you go through, that God uses them to purify us and conform us more into the image of His Son, so that we have an ability to result to praise and glorify and honor God at the revelation of Jesus Christ. That is what we're looking towards when we're counting what we can be joyous in. God is changing me for that glorious day. But Peter offers a caveat in chapter 2, verse 19. So when James says, count it all joy when you encounter trials of varied colors, right? All kinds. Some of them it's going to be physical things, some of it's going to be mental issues, physical or spiritual issues, broken relationships, poverty, whatever it might be, all kinds of trials. In the midst of that trial, take a moment to consider what joyous thing God is going to do in you. But this is not the kind of trial that you rejoice in. This is a gracious thing, verse 19, when mindful of God, one endures sorrow while suffering unjustly. And then he gives this, but by the way, for what credit is it if, when you sin and are beaten for it, you endure? But if when you do good and suffer for it, you endure, this is a gracious thing in the sight of God. Peter seems to give this caveat. By the way, if your suffering and trials are brought on by your own sinful foolishness, that's not what James is talking about either. Like, I think at times, it must have been true here for Peter to address this, that people were actually doing things and they're suffering for it, and then they're like, well, God's going to use this in my life. That's not the kind of suffering that Peter or James is talking about. So when James says, count it all joy when you encounter any kind of trial, except for the ones that you brought on by your own stupidity. Like, that's not what we're talking about. Like, I am going through a really, really, really tough time. Well, you shouldn't have done that really, really dumb thing. I mean, I wouldn't say it that way. I would be more gracious, but that's what I'd be thinking, and I want you to remember that. If I ever need to not say that to you. Why? Why is it that we count joy amidst the trials? Why can we rejoice in the midst of trials? This is the motivation that drives us. Go back to James 1. Because in this, our faith is tested. I hate tests. I've always hated tests. I would imagine most of us do. There's some of you that don't. That's great. I'm happy for you. I'm not thankful for you, but I'm happy for you. If this was a test that had to be graded, this is not the kind of test. Like, we think of tests and we're like, got to fill in all these blanks. And I'm going to be graded on this. If that was the kind of test that we'd be having, I would fail, we'd all fail miserably, and it'd be horrible. That's not the kind of test that he's talking about. However, James speaks of another kind of test. It's not one that you find in the classroom, hopefully. That would be really bad, a test of fire. That would be really extreme testing. It's not revealing so much your level of proficiency in an area. This test doesn't gauge whether you have faith or the strength of your faith. That's not its intent. Instead, the test strengthens your faith. It firms up the faith that already exists in you. Maybe your faith is weak. Well, that's the point of the test. The point of the test is to take us when we have weak faith and strengthen that weak faith. That's the point. It's a firming up of our faith. Let us go through suffering so that Christ can firm up our faith. Both David, Apostle Peter use the word testing in this same way. In Psalms, David describes God's word as pure words like silver refined or tested in a furnace. This is the kind of test that James refers to. Peter writes to the suffering church, as I read just before, he says, the tested genuineness of your faith, more precious than gold that perishes though it is tested by fire, may be found to result in praise, glory, and honor. So we know that our faith is weak, right? Any of us not have weak faith this morning? I think all of us would agree. Our faith is weak, or weaker than it should be at least. So often cluttered our faith is with doubt and frustration and failure. In His grace, God tests our faith. He rids our faith of impurities And you know what's sad is it doesn't happen once. It's not like we have this one big major testing and God rids all of the impurities of our weak faith in this one moment and we're done being strengthened and conformed to the image. That would be absolutely marvelous. I think we would like that. Yet he does it over and over and over. And he refines us a little bit at a time. That this is the Christian walk, is being refined, and our faith being strengthened, and our character being conformed to his image more and more each time. And this trial produces, so count it all joy, my brothers, when you encounter various colored trials, varied kinds of trials, knowing that the testing of your faith produces steadfastness or patience. King James translates this beautiful word, patience, here. We tend to limit our understanding of patience to really the ability to keep from becoming angry. Like I was patient, I calmed myself, I didn't get angry and erupt, right? Very, very patient. However, a display of patience involves much more than just holding back my foul temper. Consider the word picture, a man under a heavy load, determined to stay and hold the load rather than escape. So we suffer, and a load is placed on our shoulders. Instead of saying, Lord, get rid of the load, I don't want this weight. It's give me more and more patience to endure that which you allow in my life. Give me more patience to continue to hold on. There is, I think, a beautiful example that I want to show, and it's way longer than it needs to be to prove the point, so I'm going to probably skip a couple, but we need to watch like the first minute and maybe like the 4th through 6th minute and probably stop about there. But how many of you have seen the movie Unbroken? Some of you may remember in that he has to hold a beam. He's been working and he gets pulled off to the side and has to hold a beam. This is a beautiful picture of endurance and patience under pressure. Go ahead and play that, Miriam. Can you play the volume?
Pick up! 持ってこい。持ち上げろ。Lift it. Lift it. Over your head. If he drops it, shoot it.
Go ahead and jump ahead a minute and a half or so.
Come on, Louis. Don't look at me.
That's good.
Don't look.
You guys can watch the movie later today if you need to see the rest. That's patience. That's endurance. That's what God does in each of us through trial. That's what he's striving to do. I think it just came to me as I was watching. I was like, I think the work that God does in each of our lives at times can produce in others that same excitement too. The same way that those men were moved by that. I pray that for all of you regularly. Just do what you need to do, God, to conform us to your image. The Christian life is hard. The prosperity gospel is heretical and horrible and from Satan. To think that the Christian life, if it's done right, produces just prosperity in your life is completely anti-biblical. The reality is, walking with Christ is hard. So count it all joy. Rejoice when all types of trials come into your life. Because when trials come into your life, they produce in us endurance and patience of faith. That is good. And I'm thankful this year for that. Story is told, Dottie and Ed Powell came to a small village in Burkina Faso, I'm not sure I'm saying that right, West Africa, as a part of their orientation to African culture. They were beginning translation and literacy work among largely animistic people. They lived in a village of 55 people, all members of an extended family. They were to remain there for a limited time as they learned the rigors of living at the top of the Sahara Desert. The tip, it's not the top, it's kind of the bottom. 2 in the village could speak French. The rest only knew the local tongue. Daily temperatures reached above 100 degrees. The Powells kept the door of their house open for light and air. Livestock traffic and a stream of curious Africans poured through their living room. Several days after arrival in the village, Dottie became ill with dysentery. The heat and the difficulty of adjusting to native food sapped her energy. Tears of anger and self-pity flowed frequently. Then one day, she asked the Lord in desperation, "Lord, what can I do?" Be sick. That was his answer. Be sick. And Dottie Powell felt relief in accepting the task. She judged that she could handle it. She was already sick. She could do it. She was determined that she would be fabulous at the job. At the time, she did not realize the excruciating events she would face in her sickness. The day after determining that she would honor God in her sickness, she and her husband received a fax from America telling of trouble for her married daughter. Doctors could no longer pick up the heartbeat of her unborn child. When villagers learned of the concern the Powells had for their daughter, one man borrowed a motorbike, loaded Dottie on it, sickness and all, and carried her to the nearest telephone. Dottie was relieved to talk to her daughter in a hospital delivery room and to learn that mother and child were doing well. Back home in the village, Dottie complained to God, "Lord, I want to go home. I want to see my daughter, hold my grandchild. I can't stay here." And God's love responded to her during this outburst, and she stayed. She made the commitment, "Yes, Lord, I'll be sick for you." The chief elder of the village grew concerned at Dottie's inability to retain her food. He called for two Christian men to come from an evangelical church nearby and pray for her. The elder was an animist. People in his village had actively persecuted the little church. The men came and prayed, and she recovered. The Powells requested permission of the village elder to take the two French-speaking villagers with them to the church, and surprisingly, he agreed. That day, the two villagers heard the gospel, and one of them became a believer. After the Powells completed their orientation time in the village, they still maintained contact with their friends. Letters frequently come from the two French-speaking villagers to them, and one letter told of the conversion of the brother of the village elder. Dottie Powell learned that God wanted her to be faithful to him in her sickness. He did not require that she be strong or effective. She was just to be faithful, and he would compensate for her weakness. She had learned afresh her weakness. She also understood more richly God's provision. She learned that God only wanted her commitment. She was reminded that God himself had assumed a nature of weakness for the purpose of reaching the world with his saving message. She learned how true, even though tested and tried, she understood the truth that the testing of your faith develops perseverance. Like Dottie, we naturally desire the challenges and hardships or trials to stop. Are we not, though, in that moment, in essence, asking God to stop growing us? Take away my trials as God, I don't want to grow anymore. Malcolm Muggeridge, the once atheist turned believer, said, "Contrary to what might be expected, I look back on experiences that at the time seemed especially desolating and painful with particular satisfaction. Indeed, I can say with complete truthfulness that everything I have learned in my 75 years in this world, everything that has truly enhanced and enlightened my existence has been through affliction and not through happiness, whether pursued or attained. In trials, we experience growth in godliness like we never could experience any other way." This is not encouraging to us today if our goal is a comfortable life. Your best life now. Trash. If that's your goal, to have your best life now, trials will never be a joy to you. However, James, Peter, Paul, Romans 5, count it all joy. We encounter all kinds of trials because we rejoice that in the midst of trials, God is producing in us a more robust and mature faith. I'm going to go ahead and ask the instrumentalist to come up. We're going to have our final song in just a moment. I'll go ahead and pray. Lord, we are just very normal people. I think all of us, if we are honest with ourselves and assess our natural bent, the very first thing we think of when we go through suffering is that we want you to remove it. And I don't know that there's any reason to struggle denying that. That's the reality that we struggle with. We do naturally desire comfort. I mean, and I don't know that we should be different as if we long for discomfort or long for suffering and hardship. But we do ask that you would do a specific work in our hearts. You've allowed a lot of suffering in our church. A lot. I doubt it's comparative to what the believers, the dispersion that Peter writes to are going through, or necessarily the recipients of what James was writing, but we are going through a lot. People are struggling with varied kinds of trials, and they're real and hard for us. And our faith is tested in them, and sometimes our faith, it's like, I just want to stop, because it's easier to just give up than to persevere through. But gloriously, you began a good work in us, and you will perform it till the day of the return of Christ. And in that, we're thankful. Our disposition may be to hate trials and testing and suffering, but help us amid that, as we grieve, to find immense joy because you're perfecting us. In Jesus' name, amen.